If you're like me, you've been seeing on the news and reading online all kinds of stuff that imply that the real estate market is in trouble and this is a terrible time to buy a new house. Hey everyone, McKee Smith, Senior Real Estate Specialist and Realtor with Competitive Edge Realty here. And today, I'm with Charles Mentesana with ServiceFirst Mortgage.
How are you?
I'm doing great.
Good.
Charles is going to explain to us why today is still a very good time to buy a new home.
Well, yes, McKee, you did hit it on nail on the head, right? Everybody, doom and gloom in the news, right? Doom and gloom. It's not doom and gloom. Today is still a great time to buy. The reason that's a great time to buy is that real estate is an inflation hedge, right? Because real estate's always going to be increasing. At least in Texas, it typically does. Last 3 months, 4 months, it has increased 13, 14%, but now we're seeing it coming back down to the normal 3 to 5%. Well, the problem with the news is they're telling you, well, rates are going up, don't buy. Prices are going up, don't buy. Well, we need to strategize and we need to structure your loan so that you can still buy. Yes, rates are higher, but last month, you were willing to pay $50,000 to $100,000 over the ask price with the rates not much lower than they are today. They were still higher. So now, why don't you're not gonna be paying as much for the home and the rates are a little bit higher, but it's gonna work out and you might even have a better payment than you would have a month ago, even with a little bit higher rates because you're not paying $600,000 for that $500,000 home. Real estate builds wealth for you because you're paying a mortgage and it's for you. Right, so as you build your equity, later down the road, you're either gonna have a free and clear house, you can sell, you can tap into the equity, whatever you need to do, so you're building wealth there. There's just a lot of things right now that are going in a positive direction with rates. You can always refinance. Mm-hmm. You know, when the rates do finally drop again. We know they will because there's always a little bit of a cycle where rates do drop. Mm-hmm. It's usually 2 or 3 years. Then we can get into a refinance and help you. Another thing that's happening now is that sellers are needing to sell, so they're willing to pay a little bit. They're willing to give you some closing costs. So we take that closing cost and maybe we buy the rate down. You know, we do a permanent rate buy down where the rate stays low. Maybe we do a 2-1 buy down where they use those closing costs where your first year you start with a really low rate. I don't know, 3.5 maybe, right? Your second year in the mortgage, you go to a 4.5% rate. And then your third year, you go to a 5.5% rate. So you slowly build up to the higher payment. However, if the rates drop somewhere in there, you just refinance into a lower rate anyway and get a permanent lower rate.
Well, that all sounds great. And obviously, it's still a good time to get a new home. If you've got any mortgage-related questions, I'll have Charles's number. It's on the screen right now. And if you have any real estate related questions, here are all of my contact information. I answer all of these. Remember, McKee has the keys to selling your home. Bye for now.